Hello, everyone, and welcome to What's Wrong with the Podcast. Today, we're delighted to be talking to Dr. Robert J. Lang. Dr. Lang has been folding origami for over 50 years and is now recognized as one of the world's leading masters of the art, with over 800 designs. He's noted for designs of great detail and realism. His work combines aspects of the Western school of mathematical origami design with the Eastern emphasis upon line and form to yield work that is distinctive, elegant, and challenging to fold. His work has been exhibited in museums around the world, including Paris, Los Angeles, the Kaga Museum of Origami in Japan, and the Museum of Modern Art in New York City. Dr. Lang was the first Westerner invited to address the Nippon Origami Association's annual meeting in 1992, and has been an invited guest at international origami conventions around the world. Dr. Lang is one of the pioneers of the cross-disciplinary marriage of origami with mathematics and has presented numerous refereed technical papers on origami mathematics at mathematical and computer science professional meetings. He's the author, co-author, and editor of 21 books and numerous articles on origami, received Caltech's Distinguished Alumni Award in 2009, and was elected a Fellow of the American Mathematical Society in 2013. Welcome.
Thank you.
Thank you so much for being here today. It's lovely meeting you. Please do tell us more about yourself and how you came to be an origami artist.
Well, origami came first in my life. It started when I was about 6 years old. I wasn't specifically seeking out origami. I was looking for things to do, and I found, or someone gave me, a craft book that had instructions for just a handful of origami figures, some of the traditional designs. And so I thought, oh, this looks fun. I'll try this. And it was fun. And the neat thing about origami was that I didn't need any other materials other than paper, and paper was free. So I folded those same four figures over and over. My parents saw that this was something I was doing a lot of, and so they thought, well, this might be a good topic for birthday presents and the like. So they'd give me books for my birthday with more origami figures. And of course, that just fed the obsession. The more I learned, the more I wanted to learn. And so that inspired a passion for origami that has stuck with me pretty much my whole life.
So I guess, how did you divert from origami and then came back to it? Is a better question. Or did it really help you choose what you want to focus on to study also?
It didn't really guide my study. It was something that I always thought of as a hobby, the sideline. But going through school, particularly in high school, another thing I had a chance to encounter in a book with was recreational mathematics, specifically the books of Martin Gardner, who wrote a column for 25 years in Scientific American magazine. And he, in fact, inspired a generation or two of mathematicians through his incredible writing about math. And that got me very interested in math. So I pursued math through high school. I found I was pretty good at it and thought that would lead to a career in something mathematical or scientific. So I went to Caltech on the recommendation of a family friend. Originally, I thought I would study math, but when I got there, I found the math in my classes wasn't as fun as I remembered, but engineering was really fun. And so I ended up majoring in electrical engineering. And then over the course of my bachelor's, master's, and PhD, evolved from electrical engineering to applied physics, and ended up doing the study of lasers, specifically semiconductor lasers, for my PhD work in the field of applied physics. And so that was just sort of a natural evolution of career interest. But then that led, after I graduated, to working for NASA for about 4 or 5 years, and then going to Silicon Valley. And I was with a company in Silicon Valley for about 10 years.
Mm-hmm.
But over that whole time, origami was a very passionate hobby. And although it ebbed and flowed as I was growing up, there would be times I didn't spend much time on it, and times that I did. When I got to Caltech, something changed. And the way I think about it, what changed was that this was the first time in my life that the mental engine was really being revved hard. Because Caltech's it's a challenging place.
Yeah.
And so it revved the engine into high gear. And I think that that revving spilled over into other areas. And it revved up my interest in origami as well. So even though I've been doing origami all along, it really took off again for me, still as a sideline, but beginning in my college years. And then that part stayed in high gear, and is still there.
And finally became full force. And I believe you left the company that you were working on to fully pursue and consult also in it, right?
Yeah, it finally took over my life. It wasn't as well thought out as it sounds. In that I wasn't saying I'm now going to be a full-time origami consultant and be successful at it, but rather it was driven by a smaller decision that I wanted to write a book about how to design origami. And although I had been writing books of my designs, recipe collections, all along, and gotten pretty well known for that, but I had an idea, and I'd had this idea for 10 years, to describe how to design origami so that people could not just follow the instructions for my figures, but they could figure out how to make their own figures, how to create their own things that had never been done before. And I felt like I could write that book. But over the 10 years that I was working in Silicon Valley, I found that I couldn't make any headway on this book. And I came to the conclusion that in order to write this book, that had to be my main focus. And it hit me, this book would probably never get written unless I did something different. And the something different was leave, at least temporarily, the career path in Silicon Valley, spend some time focusing on the book. And so that's what I did. I said, I can live off my savings for a little while. I'm going to write this book. And so I quit and I started working on origami. But then I also thought, well, I'm also going to follow up on all the interesting origami leads that I'd never been able to when I had a full-time job, and see what comes of those. And that turned out to be both pretty fulfilling, rewarding, and enough to keep me busy, and after a couple of years, employed. So a couple of years went by, and I looked back on, I thought, I'm done with the book. Do I go back? And I thought, no, I'm having way more fun now. So I'm just going to keep up with this. And it's been going for 20 years.
Oh my God, amazing. You're like the, picture of like, do what you love. I think even if, you're like working on so many different fields and so many crazy projects, you can still like follow your passion and keep with it. And yeah, it can turn into something. I mean, it doesn't necessarily always have to be like, this is my business plan and this is how I'm going to launch. But because you're so passionate about it and there's no one like you, really, I'm so glad you left to write the book, because probably it would have been never written. Exactly. So it's really, really fascinating to hear. And I think it's such an important thing, almost like a responsibility to next generations, I want to say, because I think there is one of the reasons why we also reached out to you. I mean, as an architecture and design studio, whenever we look at origami forms, we're fascinated kind of the structural thinking behind it as well. And that is very fascinating for us. And it also, I think, is very relevant to so many of the conversations around, responsive environments, or, self-expanding or contracting houses or buildings, like all of these conversations. I love always like going back to an ancient art or the source or an origin where like you find some answers there. So origami might be perceived as an art, but it seems like it could also be a vessel or a tool or an enabler for other things as well. So can you please talk a little bit on that?
Yeah, people talk about art and science as if they were this very different dichotomy, two completely different boxes that you're either doing one or doing the other. But I don't see them that way. And I actually think a lot of scientists don't see them that way, that everything is sort of on a continuum. what does set science apart is that there is a structured way about going about the scientific method and using the tools of science. In fields like engineering, where you're kind of using the tools of science, but there is always this element of creativity, and the element of aesthetics guiding your investigation. Many scientists, especially in math, people will say,
Mm-hmm.
I'm going to follow this path because it's elegant, it's beautiful. I'm seeking beauty in the structure of mathematics. So these concepts that are in art of creativity and elegance and aesthetics and so forth are throughout science. And in science, and especially in engineering, we can draw upon things we've learned from the arts, um, structures, forms, mechanisms, things that may have arisen originally in an artistic concept. If we recognize them, we abstract them, then we can develop those into tools that are used in the scientific field, engineering field, design, um, that maybe remove them or at least stretch out that connection to the art. But that connection is always there. So there's a little bit of art in all of science,
Mm-hmm.
and there can be a little or even a lot of science over in the art.
I guess like also origami is the perfect embodiment, and like I guess mini prototypes or 3D models to sort of show that, because I think it not only requires a certain level of understanding in sciences, but also it requires a lot of patience. I think all of the above. We've watched some of your videos. It's fascinating. We don't know how you do it. It's amazing. And it's kind of also like, that's why I love the fact that, the book around it, and not only the recipes, but what you said about helping people figure out the way to do it. Because I feel like even there's a lot to learn within the process too. Like my end result, and we have like an origami Yoda in our studio, so that makes me think of that. It doesn't look anything like yours. Like it's very weird shaped Yoda. You can tell it's Yoda, but it's very this is a disfigured Yoda. But I think during the process of it and that mental exercise, it like helps us think about other things of the other project we're working on. So there's something about that fact of it too. Just from the way of things fold or how it comes together or unfolds, I think there's a lot of things that any discipline can take away from, take example of, and it kind of requires to enjoy the process and the sort of like to figure out on your own. There's the toy designer who said something. I believe she was featured on one of the docuseries on Netflix, who said that if there's a user manual to something, then it's not a toy for like children. For them to like sort of fit, like Lego for a building shouldn't come with like how to do that building. It should, leave that creativity to the child. So understanding the essence of it is so important. So it's so true that you said that.
I want to jump in though. I would actually dispute that point.
Okay,
Because,
how?
and I think origami is the prototype of the prototype counterexample,
Okay.
because origami instructions are exactly a user manual. It's step by step. Here's how to make the thing, and
Mm-hmm.
that's the fun part. The fun part, or a big part of it, is following that path, solving all the little mini puzzles to go from step 1 to 2 to 3 to 30 to 100. That's what made it fun for me and what makes it fun for a lot of
Interesting.
people. And especially when I was a kid, origami was a way of making toys. And so
Interesting.
the user manual was key to the whole toy enjoyment
To
experience.
even transform a paper into a toy, I guess, right? But I guess like origami, then it's interesting that you say that, because I believe what she's referring to is kind of like you have the toy, now you're telling the child how to play with it, right? So I
Mm-hmm.
think like maybe but with origami, you're actually manufacturing something. I think it's like very, very interesting. So like from a sheet of paper, for you to get that Yoda, those instructions are like a puzzle, as you said. So it's like a game on its own. But the end result is a different toy, and then you're not telling people how to use the Yoda or like how to play with the Yoda,
Mhm.
but you have your toy. So maybe like I think there's two aspects to it. Like origami actually is, and which is something I also want to talk about. It sort of like it's an assembly process without assembling any parts, or it's like in the manufacturing without bringing in other ingredients. So that is so interesting, and um I want to ask if you had any type of maybe projects or consulting opportunities where you worked on where some other disciplines or industries try to learn from that and see how that could reflect into their own process.
That has, what you just described is almost the essence of the type of consulting that I do.
Hmm.
Because it is almost always in a field that really doesn't have anything to do with origami. But they're looking for some functionality, structure, or mechanism to come from the world of origami, or more broadly, the world of folding, that will solve their sort of problem. And I'd say one of the classic examples, and one of the ones I can talk about freely, are
Hmm.
in deployable structures for space. Things like antennas and telescopes and reflectors and the like. Things that have to deploy, meaning you want them to be small because they're going up in a rocket, and then you want them
Hmm.
to be large when they get out in space. And when they're large, they're sheet-like. And they're flat or more or less like a piece of paper, even though
Yeah,
they're not actually going to be made from paper. And that is an important distinction. There are lots of things that go up into space that aren't sheet-like, and they don't need origami. They use other mechanisms from mechanical engineering. But the ones that end up big and flat, like antennas
yeah.
and reflectors and the like, can then draw upon concepts from the world of folding. But
Mm.
but those concepts have to be mixed with a huge amount of concepts from mechanical engineering and materials
Sure,
science and space structures and optics and all these other fields before they can become useful. So the
sure.
origami by itself is an ingredient, but it's not the whole story.
Yeah. And yeah, I think we've seen one of your interviews where also like some of the forums of how it was like they would show, I don't know if it was like a montage of videos, but they would show like a paper form that you're showing and then like a space version of it, and like exactly what you described. So that was very I think it's mind bending to start thinking like that, and it really shows the power of collaboration of different disciplines. Especially, origami, for those who like perceive it as ancient arts, it is very, very relevant in like today's solutions too, I think. Um, any like interesting uh, other applications you think might be possible in any other different fields, or different materiality, like anything that you've worked on or think that there is potential to work on in different fields or different materials?
Yeah, there's some of both. In the different field, one of the areas that seems particularly ripe for this sort of thing is medicine.
Mm,
There's been an enormous shift in particular surgery, where we're moving away from very invasive forms of surgery to laparoscopic forms. Where they basically make tiny little holes and then put things in, and things go into tiny little holes, but then they open out and they do stuff. They
mm,
cut, or they take pictures, or they gather things and put them in bags, and all this still is something that has to be made really small for the journey, and then when it gets to the destination inside the body, it opens out and does something. And origami has turned out to play a role in making things like retractors and sheaths, catheters, and various devices for this sort of laparoscopic surgery. And I think there will continue to be more. Um, one of the pretty well-known origami examples, done not by me, but by a professor at Oxford named Zong Yu and Kaori Kurabayashi, who's now a professor in Japan, was a heart stent, a little
Hmm.
tube that folds down into a much smaller tube to travel through the body, and then opens out into a tube that holds open a blocked artery. And this was designed and based on an origami pattern. And one of the reasons I like that particular example is that the particular pattern they used, called the water bomb pattern, goes back probably hundreds of years. So that pattern was sitting there in the origami world, and it just waited for the right application and the right innovative mind to recognize its applicability.
So fascinating. And it's like a perfect example of the blend of arts and sciences, as you mentioned. Um, I think, in addition, well, I mean, as an architecture and design studio, we feel, I mean, if it's like applied already in such micro levels or even nano levels, maybe like there's explorations of this now, and in medicine, there must be a huge potential in our built environment. And especially when we're talking about adaptive or responsive environments, I think it's very interesting what we recently experienced as a global pandemic is that it showed all of us that, our built environment failed us, it doesn't work, and it's not necessarily responsive at an event like in health crisis. So do you think there is also any potential also maybe like structures or science, I guess, behind origami itself to be utilized in more like maybe emergency scenarios or like adaptiveness or responsiveness?
Oh, absolutely. First, in the area of disaster response, there have been various people who have worked on using origami to create rapidly deployable pop-up shelters, for example. But
Mm,
even in this current pandemic, there have been our applications of holding in the area, for example, of personal protective equipment. Um, I'm involved, have been for a couple of years, in fact, involved with one project that is focusing on that application, and I can't say much more
yeah,
than
sure.
that.
Yeah.
But I will mention that I'm on origami mailing lists, and a whole bunch of origami artists jumped into this problem in different ways when the pandemic started going. And so there are collaborative developments of origami-based PPE out there going on. And I think that will continue as well.
That's so exciting to hear. It makes me so happy because, I think what we've seen in the design world, I guess like there's also a marketing PR aspect of things, but like all these like rushed immediate design solutions that started to come out like during COVID, it was just like very disheartening and frustrating. We're not going to live in like plastic bubbles and eat our dinner with that, like, and these are featured in design magazines, which is a problem. But it's so great to hear that there are other studios that, or like, companies or professionals who are exploring more sustainable and genuine solutions to such an event like this. And I think it's also really seeing more and more examples of such use and talking about it sort of helps us think outside the box more and think about more diverse collaborations, because like even like in our studio, our best collaboration, I think, or like one of the most viral and talked about collaboration also came out with collaboration with material scientists, which I feel that we know maybe nothing about but really need to have an understanding to address some of the issues that we see in architecture and design. So that makes me very happy to hear. Um, so I guess like as someone who sort of like had such passion for like his entire life and then moved on to different careers, seems like, which now is also proving that only to serve you even more so at what you're doing today, because if you hadn't had those experiences, maybe you wouldn't have looked at origami at a different angle. um, what would be your advice to any young professionals that are getting started or wanting to pursue something that they really love, or for anyone who really has a passion on the side, but treating that as a hobby just because a job might be something different? What would be your advice, sort of like, I guess, to audiences?
Yeah. So my first bit of advice would start with my favorite quote from Louis Pasteur, who said, "Chance favors the prepared mind." And and what that means, at least what it meant to me, is you can't control your destiny. You can't know what opportunities will come by. But if you've prepared your mind, if you've learned a lot about a lot of different areas, then you'll have the background, you'll be able to recognize the connections to jump on that opportunity and say, oh, I can take this idea from this field and that idea from that field. And if I bring them together, I've got something new and useful. And, uh, and that kind of takes me to the other part of that advice, which is to, to learn about diverse fields. But in college we learn from textbooks, and textbooks present everything in this neat package, and it's in order and so forth. And the thing is, what's in the textbook, there's no longer anything new in that. All of the novelty happens on the edges, and the edges are messy and dirty, and it's not clear, where you go from there. But that's where all the innovation happens, when someone is on the edge of a field that's the edge of another field, and they know enough about the two fields to make the connections between them. So my advice is also to learn about a lot of different fields. Don't focus. I mean, you do need to learn a lot about something, but learn a lot about other things. And then people always ask, well, how do I pick those other things? What are the best other fields to learn? And I can't answer that because it's different for every individual. So the only advice I would say is follow your curiosity, and especially in the area of origami, I've had a lot of people who said, my teachers, my friends, my parents have kind of poo-pooed my investigation of origami. They say, that's never going to result in anything. And I say, well, they're wrong, or at least they don't know.
I'm a living example that it's wrong.
Yeah. So if you're interested in something, that's probably a good sign that it's worth pursuing. So follow your curiosity, learn about a lot of other things, and then you will have that prepared mind that Pasteur talked about.
I love those so much, both of the advices. I wish somebody had told me that, and just, follow your curiosity, I think is simple and so straight. So I think both are really, really valuable. But anything you would like to add, anything that you want to address that you're working on right now that you can briefly talk about, or other things to explore about origami, or we should be reading or following?
Well, I will mention my current project just because it's the current burning passion, occupies a lot of time, and maybe is a good example of something that may have no, certainly is not going to be very financially rewarding because it's so specialized. But I'm working on a book about the mathematics of curved folding. And a lot of it is math that, even though I had a lot of math in college that I didn't have then, I'm having to learn new math. Unfortunately, I'm collaborating with some brilliant mathematicians, professor at MIT, University of Tokyo, and a mathematician who's now in a PhD program at MIT. And they're kind of keeping me honest as far as the math. But it's just fascinating, even though, I don't know how many people will buy the book, a handful, but it's something that I have to write, if only for myself. In fact, every origami book I've written, this sounds a little, I don't know, selfish or arrogant, but I've always written the book that I wished I had. And that's the case with this one. I'm writing the book that I wish I had 20 years ago. So hopefully other people will find it useful so that, they can learn in a very short time what it took me a long time to learn.
I'm sure if you find it important to share, I'm sure there are so many people out there that will find it important and useful. And as we discuss more and more like diverse collaborations and such, and when this becomes more and more acceptable, we're seeing more of like arts and science mergers out there. I think it will be even more heavily used, and we need experts like you to pass on the information, even if you have to collaborate with other mathematicians. It's, I don't find it selfish that, you're writing at least for yourself. I think, the best songs out there ever written are all personal.
Yeah.
So as part of the creative process, it comes with it. So no, thank you for sharing that. And it was such a pleasure to have you here today.
Well, thanks for having me on.
Thank you so much for watching this week's episode. If you found value in these conversations, please like our video and hit the subscribe button. Make sure to visit our website, podcast.what'swrongwith.xyz, and subscribe to Apple Podcasts, Spotify, and Google Podcasts so you never miss an episode. Please leave us a comment or review, or you can simply tell your friends about us. For more details on our guests, follow us on Instagram and Twitter. You can find our handles in the description below. And don't forget to join us next week.